Okay, let me show you another trick here. So the water pump, all the bolts are different sizes. You can try to remember them, throw them back in the right spot. You can try to send them in, and if they back up, pull them out, put them in a different hole, whatever. It takes forever. Grab a Sharpie, start in the top middle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 bolts all in a row clockwise. Take a Sharpie, just mark them. Then you can pull them all out, throw them in a bag, throw them in a box, throw them on your tool bit, throw them in your toolbox, throw them on a shelf, whatever. And you will remember where they go because you use this top spot as one. I mean, you can write a 1 next to it or whatever too, but that's going to make your life significantly easier. They're all 13s. You do need to take a 10 millimeter and pop this tube off so you can get to this bolt, and then you can lift this out of the way when you're trying to pull the water pump off. Okay, so the water pump is off. Sorry that it's dusty. You can actually see it coming past the screen. A little more coolant came out than anticipated, which, you know, whatever, it happens. I did try turning over the motor originally to try to get some coolant pumped down into the lower radiator hose, so that way it would, you know, come out. So it is what it is. Now there is 11 bolts. The 11th bolt is right here. It is a 15 millimeter. It has a thread sticking out of it. Take that off. Do not just pry on the water pump without taking that bolt off. So hopefully you watched it this far. And then at that, you can just grab it and you can pull it right off. Once that's pulled off, you know, it's on to the next step. And the next step is going to be alternator, air conditioner, and then taking a puller and pulling that off. Once that's off, this huge large piece will come off the front of the motor, and then we can do the actual cam swap itself. Okay, apparently it's still dusty in here. Well, alternator and AC are off. The alternator is 3 15 millimeter bolts. Let it hang. This is 2 13 millimeter bolts and 1 13 millimeter nut on a stud. Remove the stud. Take the bolts out, or take the nut off the stud, remove the stud first, then take the bolts out. That way the AC can drop out of the way. The only thing left to do now is to pull off the harmonic balancer. So next step is to pull off the harmonic balancer, and then we are going to remove the front cover off the motor here. The next step is the harmonic balancer. The condenser, pick it up, turn it out of the way, use something to tie it up so it's out of your way. 3-jaw puller. This thing was like $100 at a parts store. I bought it like 5 years ago. I use this 3 to 4 times a week pulling harmonic balancers off. This might not be the right way to do it. Other people might disagree, but whatever. This is what works for me, and I've never broken one of these. You just have to be careful with how you do it. I use this to pull it off. Then when we put it back on, we push it on a little bit, and we use a board and a mallet and tap it in until we get it where we can get 3 or 4 threads in. And then we use the impact to slow push it in, or we use this, you know, a socket wrench to crank it in slowly, because obviously you don't want to rip the threads out. So here you go. Pretty much the moment of truth here. We have more than likely 3 10 millimeter bolts here. One probably back here, one probably back there. So 5 10 millimeter bolts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 13 millimeter bolts. And then you can peel it off from the top, and you peel it so far forward and you pick it straight out. Now obviously make sure that you get everything unplugged, and you try not to break any of these plugs. Use a screwdriver to push the pin in if you have to. You know, you don't want to have to come back in here and screw with these sensors. You want it right the first time. So from there, that'll get us to the next step. Cover's off. Now the cover's kind of a pain because you do have this water line going to the back of it, and then this, so you got to kind of jimmy it around to get it to twist and come off. So technically, the next step is going to be remove all the coils, unplug all the coils, remove the valve covers. Once the valve covers are removed, you're going to have to take the valve train out. Now, But what you want to do first, because it is a pain to turn the motor over, and I haven't found it yet. I haven't really looked yet completely. So there is going to be a timing mark on here somewhere. This is the cam phaser. There will be a timing mark somewhere on this cam phaser, and we basically spin it so that way we have a timing mark pointing straight up and down. Once we have a timing mark straight up and down, we can essentially take this off here. This is the cam tensioner or chain tensioner. Then we can pull the chain and the cam phaser off, okay? Once those are off, we can spin the cam around a couple times, which will actually push the lifters back up into the motor. Now, you have to be very careful and fast when you do this. Once you don't hear it tapping on any lifters anymore, like, because you'll hear them click them up. So spin around 3, 4, 5, 10 times, whatever. At that point, cam can come out. Be as careful as you can, holding it steady when you pull it out. Grab the new cam, have it already covered in either some sort of an assembly lube or break-in lube. Slide her back in. Once it's slided in, you can turn it to the right spot, put the cam phaser, chain, everything back right to where it belongs, put the tensioner on. Just like that, your motor is right where it needs to be. Some people will say the right thing to do is remove this oil pump. The remove the oil pump is a pain. So you have to remove all 4 of these bolts, and then you have to somehow get this bolt out without dropping it in your oil pan, and then you kind of have to wiggle and jimmy it off. If not, if you can't do that, this oil pan's got to come off. Then the oil pump can come off, then you can time it correctly, blah, 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 blah. It is a pain. If you were not changing the oil pump, just turn the motor to a spot with a timing mark that you're going to be able to match that spot up. Now, to put this back on, it might be a pain because of these water tubes. If that's the case, you might have to take this intake off and then pull these water tubes out of the way, put this cover back on, put the water tubes back in, put the intake back on. Not a bad idea because, you know, you can see like this here, obviously he's got an intake leak. Definitely has an intake leak. Looks like on both sides. You know, and this is actually a low mileage car. So, you know, this is where we're at. So, you know, what I'm going to do here next is I'm going to end up pulling all the valve covers and coil off. I'm sorry, I'm going to turn the motor. I'm going to put the bolt back in. I'm going to turn the motor so I got the timing gear in the right spot. Then I'm going to pull the valve covers off, pull the valve train out. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because it's very hard to turn the motor over once you remove the valve train, unless you pull the spark plugs, because you need somewhere for the air to go. Otherwise, you have to move it super slow and let the air bleed past everything, and it is a pain because you're essentially letting the air bleed past the rings. So next step, valve covers, 10 millimeter bolts on the coils, and looks like 8 millimeter bolts on the valve covers themselves. And then chances are the valve train themselves are 8 millimeters. Pay attention to where they go. You don't want to lose the parts, but typically they can only go in one way. Okay, so valve covers are off. Kind of a pain. 8 millimeter, or you can use a 5/16. You know, sometimes you don't really have 8s. I mean, I lose 8s more than I lose 10s. So the next step, after, like I said, after you get this right to the timing gear correctly, is you're going to want to pull the whole valve train on each side. That way the motor's not fighting you when you try to put the cam in. Otherwise, if you were to, you wouldn't even be able to pull the cam out right now because the lifters are being pushed onto the cam. So that's the next step. You know, intake, exhaust. Push rods are different lengths. So if you're not changing the lifters, leave the push rods in unless you're changing the push rods. And obviously, we'd be pulling the heads if we were changing the lifters. So that's the next step. So I'm going to pull that off after I get this timing gear set, and then we'll go from there. This motor's been apart, which is weird, you know, unless it's maybe it got MDS lifters. No, it's a manual car, so it doesn't have MDS lifters. So you see these 2 marks on the chain. That mark right there is the timing gear, and it is supposed to be in the center of that chain. So whoever took it apart honestly really didn't care, I guess. So we are going to, when we're going to put this single mark back up to the top center where it belongs when we do this swap, And then we are going to, when we finish, put the chain back on. We are going to put the chain back on in the correct location. That way it's easier for the next person that is inside this motor.